does not start. Alright, so when this happens, the first thing I usually do is to check for spark. So I grab my spark tester, or if you don't have a spark tester, you can just grab a spare spark plug. Then you remove one of your spark plug wires, and then you install your spark plug at the end of it. Next, you can ground your spark plug by using some jumper cables. So you put one end on this end, on the base of your spark plug, and the other end on the negative side of your battery. Next, we're going to get in our car, turn the engine, and look and see whether we're getting spark or not. Alright, now before we start the diagnostic procedure for no spark, it's a very good idea to go to your under hood and also inside the cabin fuse box and check every single fuse and relay that's related to your ignition system. And you usually have a diagram on the back of the cover that tells you which fuse and relay is for what. Alright, so now we're just going to work our way back from the spark plug to see which component is not doing its job. Now if you have an older car like this 95 Toyota Camry, you're going to have a distributor before your spark plug, which is what we're going to check next. But if you have a newer car like this 2004 Saturn Ion, you won't have a distributor, and before your spark plug you would have your ignition coil pack. So that's what you would need to check, and we'll get to that in a second. Now the easiest way to check to see whether your distributor is doing its job or not is to the process of elimination, which is basically you follow that back. See this wire that goes to your ignition coil, and then we're going to remove this wire and check to see whether we're getting spark coming out of this ignition coil. If we get spark coming out of this, but it's not reaching our spark plugs, we're going to replace the distributor, cap and rotor, plus all the spark plug wires. But if we're not getting spark coming out of this, then we're going to follow that further back. There we go. And the way I'm going to check this ignition coil is to get a screwdriver, put it in here where the spark would come out, and then grab another screwdriver and grind it out like this. Then I'm going to get someone to crank the engine and get the screwdriver close to this one without touching it and see whether I get a spark here or not. Alright, so as you saw, we're getting spark at our ignition coil, but that spark is not making it to our spark plugs. And that's because there's a problem probably with either the cable that goes from our ignition coil to our distributor or the distributor cap and rotor itself. Usually when you buy the distributor cap and rotor, it's a good idea to replace all these spark plug wires and that wire that supplies the spark from your ignition coil. But if you're trying to save a buck, you can test this wire, and if you get spark at the end of the wire but not out of the distributor, then you can just replace the distributor cap and rotor. But I recommend you just replace the wires with the distributor cap and rotor all at the same time. Alright, now let's say you don't get spark out of your ignition coil either. Alright, so on an older setup like this, you have one ignition coil that supplies spark for all your 4 cylinders. And that ignition coil is going to get one wire that has 12 volts and another wire that's the signal wire. So here's a look at our connector for this ignition coil. It's got 2 wires. One of these should have 12 volts with the key in the on position with engine off. But sometimes you have to crank the engine to get the 12 constant voltage here. And as you can see, the second one, this one, we're getting a voltage here. And this is going to be this white and red wire on this ignition coil. But the proper way to check the signal wire is with the connector attached to our ignition coil, because that signal that comes from our the constant travels through the ignition coil and out the other wire, which goes to your ignition control module or your car's computer, and then your car's computer turns off that signal, and that's what causes for you to have spark at your ignition coil. So this has to be attached in order for that voltage to travel through your ignition coil, okay? And then we're going to back probe this wire. Alright, as you can see, I back probed that wire and I attached it to my test light with these alligator clamps. Now I'm just going to crank the engine. If this test light blinks, that means this ignition coil should produce a spark, and if it's not, it means it's bad. Alright, so as you saw, we got our test light to blink. It was actually really fast, so on camera it might look like it was just flickering, but it was actually blinking. So that means that we're getting both signal and constant voltage to our ignition coil. And if you don't have spark coming out of that ignition coil, that's going to mean that ignition coil is bad. Now on most modern cars, you're going to have what's called an ignition coil pack, which looks like this for a 4-cylinder. Now on this one, in reality, you have 2 ignition coils. You got one supplying spark for cylinder number 2 and 3, and you get another one supplying a spark to cylinder number 1 and 4. And of course, you test these the same way. You first check to see on the connector where you're getting constant voltage supplied to this ignition coil, and then you test the other 2 to make sure you're getting a signal. Also, on some ignition coil packs, you might have an extra pin here for ground, so you want to check on that too. And of course, if you have a 6-cylinder or an 8-cylinder, you're going to have another one of these. So you would have 3 of these for a 6-cylinder and an extra one if you have an 8-cylinder car. Now, if you're not getting 12 volts supplied to your ignition coil, you want to get your hand on some wiring diagrams for your car and follow that wire back. Make sure you check on all the wiring, all the connectors, any fuses or relays that are in the way, and you make sure all of them are working properly. Now, on the other hand, if you're not getting signal to your ignition coil, what you want to do is also check the wiring and the connectors, but what's responsible for timing the signal that's sent from your car's computer to your ignition coil is going to be your crankshaft position sensor. Now, your crankshaft position sensor looks like this. There are 2 main type of sensors. You gotta have one sensor that has 3 pins or 3 wires. These sensors will require 12 volts to work. The other one has only 2 pins or 2 wires. These are voltage producing sensors, and they don't need any amount of power or voltage to work. And these usually live right above your crankshaft gear, and as your crankshaft gear turns, when you crank the engine, these teeth that are on your gear set off a signal from your crankshaft position sensor to your car's computer. Then that's how your car's computer knows when to signal your ignition coils to fire off a spark. So you'll usually need to find the connector or the wiring harness for your crankshaft position sensor, and then get your multimeter and check to see whether it's putting out any voltage or not. Now, on some cars, if you have a tachometer, you can just look at the needle on there, and if it moves, then that means you're getting signal from your crankshaft position sensor, but that's not always the case. On some cars, that needle is not going to move unless the engine is cranking past a certain speed. This car being one of them, because I know it has a good crankshaft position sensor, but still that needle didn't move. Also, something that I forgot to mention in the beginning of this video, the first thing you should do is to check your car's computer for any fault codes. A lot of times that will lead you to where the problem is. But also, I've done some other videos regarding the ignition system on both the distributor system and also a distributorless system, plus a video on how you can test the crankshaft or camshaft position sensor. And I'll put a link to those videos on this side of the screen. There'll also be links in the description box for you to check as well. Alright, so let's say your engine does get spark. If that's the case, what you want to check next is to see whether it's getting fuel as well or not. Now, a quick way to see whether the fuel is your problem or not is to use some starting fluid. Basically, all you have to do is to find a way to spray some starting fluid for a few seconds inside your air intake hose. You either remove a sensor or undo this from the air filter box, spray some of this in there, and then if you can start the car and it runs for a couple seconds, then that means you have a problem with fuel. Either it's fuel pressure, that's your problem, or your fuel injectors are not working properly. Alright, so if fuel is your problem, the first thing you need to check on is to see whether you have pressure or not in your fuel system. So on most cars, either on the fuel rail right above your fuel injectors or the piping that goes to it, you're going to have a pressure port like this. And these are for connecting a pressure gauge like this, which will tell you exactly how many psi of pressure you have in this fuel line. And that's with the key on, engine off. You should also cycle the key on off a couple times to make sure you build up enough pressure in your fuel rail. And as you can see, we got about 50 psi of pressure in this fuel rail, which is about spec for this car. Now, a very crude way of telling whether you have fuel pressure in that line or not is to basically get a bunch of rag, put it around that pressure fitting, and then with the key in the on position, you get a screwdriver and you press that little Schrader valve in. You're going to have a lot of fuel coming at you at about 50 psi, but again, if you don't have a pressure gauge, that's just basically going to tell you have some pressure in the fuel line. Alright, so if you have no pressure in your fuel rail, that usually points to a problem with your fuel pump or its circuit. But if you have low pressure, then that potentially could mean you either have a weak fuel pump or a clog in your fuel lines, which could be due to a partially clogged fuel filter. Now, before we go over to your fuel pump, you should take your time and check every fuse and relay again in your fuse box. Once again, look in the cover to find the fuse and the relay related to your fuel pump and check them. And if your fuse and relay check out fine, then it's time to go over to your fuel pump, gain access to the connector to it, and check the connector for ground and power. But make sure you watch this video I've made on how to diagnose a fuel pump properly, because it's important you do it correctly, because if you don't, then you're going to spend a lot of time and money replacing a fuel pump, all the while that's not your problem and it's something else. Now, if your engine runs when you spray starting fluid and you have fuel pressure, then the main culprit is going to be your fuel injectors. Now, it's highly unlikely that more than one of your fuel injectors has failed, therefore your engine is not starting, but what's more likely is that the system that's responsible for turning these fuel injectors on and off at the right time is not working properly. So first, you'll need to find your fuel injectors and then remove one of the connectors that goes to them. So each fuel injector is going to have two wires. One of them is going to supply it with constant voltage. The other one is going to be the ground wire. And your car's computer is going to use the ground side to switch the fuel injector on and off. So after removing the connector to one of the injectors, you want to get your multimeter and test both wires and make sure you're getting constant voltage. It's either going to be, I think, 5 or 6 volts or 12 volts on most injectors supplied to each injector. And you can find that out by your multimeter. You should get that at constantly with the key on, engine off. Now, if you're not getting constant voltage to your fuel injectors, there's a very good chance there's a problem with your connectors, the wiring, or one of the relays or the fuses that are on the path of that wire that supplies voltage to your fuel injectors. Now, as far as checking the ground side and make sure it's pulsing when you're cranking the engine, you can use a multimeter or a test light. But the correct tool for this is called a ᴏᴜ light. You can rent these at your local auto parts store. You're going to get a set ᴏᴜ lights for different makes and models. That plugs into the harness for your fuel injector, and when you're cranking the engine, that ᴏᴜ light is going to blink, telling you both have constant voltage, and the ground side is also being switched on and off. Therefore, there's no problem with the circuit that's going to your fuel injector. Now, if you find that you are getting constant voltage to your fuel injectors, but the ground side is not being switched on and off by your car's computer, here are the main culprits. Alright, now on some cars, when your crankshaft position sensor goes bad, it not only cuts off spark, but also your injector pulse is turned off as well. But on some cars, you need to check your camshaft position sensor as well. Again, this sensor works similar to the crankshaft position sensor, but it's located right behind or next to your camshaft gear. And on some cars, if that sensor goes bad, then that's your injector pulse is going to be turned off. Therefore, you're not going to be able to start your car. Also, next, your throttle position sensor could also cause a no injector pulse condition. As some of you may know, whenever you want to disable your fuel system, you press your gas pedal all the way to the floor, and then when you crank the engine, your engine is not going to turn on, it's just going to crank because your fuel system is disabled. Well, the sensor that's responsible for that is your throttle position sensor. That's the sensor that tells your car's computer you had wide open throttle, and if for some reason your throttle position sensor is failed and it's sending that voltage to your car's computer, which is telling it the throttle plate is all the way open, well, you've disabled your fuel system, you're not going to get an injector pulse, and that's why you're not able to start your car. Now also on some cars, a bad MAF sensor can also cause you to not have an injector pulse. A lot of times though, a bad MAF sensor will cause your car to run very poorly, but not completely keep it away from starting. But on other cars, a bad MAF sensor can cause your car not to have injector pulse, therefore not start. Now, if your car comes with a MAF sensor, it's usually going to go either on the fuel filter box or on this air hose that goes to your intake manifold from your air filter box. Now, if you suspect the problem with that, something that sometimes helps is to simply remove the connector from this sensor. If that's the problem, which is causing you to not have injector pulse, a lot of times by removing the connector, your car's computer goes into default mode and bases its calculation on the air-fuel mixture on some preset parameters, and therefore you're able to start your car. Alright, so if you find that you're getting both spark and fuel, but you're still not able to start your car, then the main remaining culprit is going to be a mechanical problem with your engine. And the main culprit with the mechanical problem with your engine is going to be a lack of compression. Now, one way to see whether compression is your problem or not is to simply listen to the engine. An engine with low compression is going to turn over very quickly. Alright, so in the video that you just saw, that was an engine that had the timing belt on it was torn. Therefore, the valves were not closing, they were just simply staying open. Therefore, there was no compression in the combustion chamber and the engine was turning over very rapidly. Now, a torn timing belt is only one of the reasons why you can have low compression. An overheated engine with a blown head gasket is also not going to have compression. An engine that has problems with the piston rings, or even an engine where the timing belt has slipped, they're all not going to have compression, therefore are going to keep your car away from starting. Now, a definitive way to see whether you have compression in your engine or not is to simply do a compression test. Basically, you would remove your spark plugs and install this pressure gauge into each spark plug hole and crank the engine, and this is going to tell you exactly how many psi of pressure you have in each cylinder. Now, if you find that you have both spark, fuel, and you have compression in each cylinder, but you're still unable to start your car, well, in that case, there's either a problem in your intake, maybe something is clogging it up, keeping air from entering your engine, or a problem in your exhaust where something is clogging up the exhaust pipe and in turn keeping exhaust fumes from exiting your combustion chamber. And if that's the case, the main culprit is going to be your catalytic converter, either breaking up and then clogging your exhaust pipe, or getting really dirty and clogging up and not allowing enough exhaust fumes to exit your engine. But this doesn't happen overnight. There's going to be other signs leading up to it being this bad where it keeps your engine from starting, but it's definitely a possibility. And that's going to be it for this video. I'm sure I forgot some stuff that could cause a crank no start condition, but this should be a very good beginning for people trying to diagnose this problem on their own. So yeah, I hope that you liked this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to see more like it. But also, again, check out these related videos I'll put up on this side of the screen for you to click on. There'll also be links in the description box down below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.